Okay, for a breakdown of this week's testimony, we're joined by Stephanie Carvin. She's an associate professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Professor Carvin specializes in national security issues. Leah West is an assistant professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and Professor West specializes in national security law. So thanks for coming back. It was great to chat with you last week as well. Stephanie Carvin, I want to start with you. We got a pretty clear portrait of infighting and disorganization and a lack of unity inside the convoy. I mean, what's your takeaway from that evidence?
So, there definitely was a lot of infighting. What was interesting, actually, is that given the opportunity to kind of, perhaps separate yourself from some of the comments that Pat King has made, some of the more infamous comments, a lot of the convoy organizers just didn't. Right? They didn't take the opportunity to really distance themselves from, some of the more critical remarks. I mean, Jeremy McKenzie was just testifying this afternoon. But again, he was described as a funny fellow with a comedy podcast. So that was kind of interesting. There clearly was that tension, but given the opportunity, they seem to be kind of trying to stand a little bit strong together.
Right. So Leah West, when we look at this, it seems pretty clear from the evidence we've seen from police and from the convoy's own evidence themselves that very little functional control over what was happening on the street. So when you look at that, I mean, how does that factor into Judge Rouleau's thinking as he assesses the whole situation that happened?
Well, I think it was really important from the perspective, and you saw the OPS lawyers and the OPP lawyers and even the government of Canada trying to get at this, was could you be negotiated with? Could we get to a place where we could get everybody at the table and actually have that have an impact on the streets? And I think from what we saw, the answer to that is no. There wasn't enough sufficient control. There wasn't enough unity of purpose. They weren't an item on a lot of different things. So enforcement was going to be the way by which this ended, not some sort of sit-down kumbaya meeting.
Right. Stephanie Carvin, do you agree with that? There was no way a negotiation was going to get this done, because even when they tried to move some trucks around, they were sabotaging each other and taking over their Twitter feeds, and, it was problematic.
Yeah, at best. But I think on top of that, one of the things we really learned this week was just, these guys really were in their own reality bubble. I mean, when asked multiple times, didn't you see all the police announcements? Didn't you see the posters we put up in the elevators? Didn't you hear that the Ottawa residents were unhappy? They all said no. They said, I saw Woodstock. I saw people who loved us. They had said multiple times that they thought they had the right to be there, whether because of their lawyer's advice or because it was their democratic right. They just didn't see anything wrong with that. And they, I don't know how you burst that bubble.
Or if they saw it, they didn't believe it. They thought it was fake or a trick, right? Right,
exactly. So this is just it. So it's like if they saw it, if it confirmed what they already believed, then they believe it. But if they, if they saw it, they didn't go with what they said, they would think it was fake or ignore it. And how do you negotiate with that? Right. How do you negotiate with someone who just lives in an entirely different reality bubble?
Right. So, Leah West, you said enforcement was the only way to end this. But what we also learned this week is they were being tipped off on enforcement measures, that there was, the Ottawa police, the OPP, whoever, the RCMP, even CSIS, it was suggested by Keith Wilson, was sharing information with the convoy organizers. What's the significance of that revelation?
I don't think that is overly surprising to anybody who followed it. There was expectations that at least OPS was sharing information. I think we do need to be cautious when we're taking it from the organizers. What do they mean by leak? Was someone saying, I heard this, or someone coming to them with information, or was someone giving them a heads up like, we're going to come in and enforce today, right? Is that's not necessarily a leak. That could be forewarning. So I think we do have to take this idea of leaks with a grain of salt, but I do think that there's definitely enough smoke for there to be fire with respect to leaks from law enforcement.
Well, and Stephanie Carvin, there was the real-time stuff. Jeremy McKenzie, who you referenced, he testified today, the head of Diagolon, as it's called. He was getting screen grabs of internal RCMP text chains. I don't know if you remember this, talking about what was happening at the Chateau Laurier, where they were staging. But I just wonder, again, because we want to keep this focus on what Judge Rouleau has to look at and consider, when you've got this lack of control and then this leaking like a straw diaper going on from the police forces, how does a judge assess that dynamic?
That's going to be a really interesting picture, and I think it's going to speak to, was the police capable of actually achieving the goal without, more powers or things like this? I think that's going to be ultimately how it's weighed in that equation. But I mean, beyond that, I think that it also just, plays into, if this week's narrative was about kind of disorganization among the convoy organizers, last week was disorganization among the police.
Yes, two disorganized organizations banging into each other.
And it turns out great. No, it really doesn't. So I think that that's going to be a part almost of last week's narrative.
Right. So I want to touch on the money, because we got a decent explanation of some of the financing and the fundraising. It was crypto, cash, crowdfunding. GoFundMe had about 14,000 donors from the United States. But then when it switched to Give, Send, Go, basically it was 50-50, U.S. American donors. We heard the government talk a lot, Leah West, about foreign interference. Does this rise to the level of foreign influence and foreign interference in something like this? I know it's not a state actor, but there were a lot of Americans invested in this, it seems.
There was a lot of Americans, and there was obviously American media and American politicians who were interested in advancing the narrative of the convoy because it served their interests. We typically don't think of foreign interference, especially when we're talking about that threats to the security of Canada definition that would give rise to a public order emergency. Individual actors donating to a cause in a country that you agree with is not typically considered foreign interference. We have lots of Canadians who donate to democratic causes in other countries where their governments wouldn't necessarily be in favor of that. That doesn't necessarily give rise to what we would consider a national security threat.
Does that dynamic, Stephanie Carvin, change at all when it is an illegal occupation, as the police and the courts are determining of a nation's capital? Because that's not just a pro-democracy protest. They were locking down the Capitol.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I have to agree with Leah. I mean, part of the definition of foreign interference, it has to be clandestine in nature and these kinds of things. And so, I mean, they're pretty openly supporting this. This wasn't a clandestine thing. I think to a certain extent, the bigger questions I have that I don't know if we'll ever get answers to was not so much the fundraisers as, the email donations, the cash donations. Those we don't have as much eyesight on. And this is something a good friend of ours, Jess Davis, who works on threat financing, has pointed out numerous times that this is actually where we don't have good oversight and where there may have been more of a problem, but I don't think we know. And it seems hard to believe that it was, as Leah says, it's foreign, but doesn't necessarily mean it's the national security threat, foreign interference. Right.
So we've got about a minute left. So Professor West will keep doing sort of a running jury assessment of this. I mean, based on what we've learned this week, stacked on top of what we learned last week, where are we on whether the Emergencies Act was appropriate? Has the case been made yet with the evidence, or is there still a lot more to be done?
I still think we need to hear the intelligence that speaks to the national security threat.
Right.
And we haven't heard that. What we did hear a lot about today, or over the course of the week, was I think that it would be arguable to suggest that the movement to overthrow the government was a violent, organized movement, as we heard some talk when the Emergency Act was evoked. That kind of sentiment was being led by some of the supporters of the Emergency Act. I don't think that we could say that. But in terms of the violence, we learned that the convoy organizers didn't have control over the violence. And we knew from the very beginning, from the ITAC threat assessment, that people trying to co-opt the movement and could potentially act in a violent manner was a threat. And I'd like to see the intelligence on that moving forward before I can make a decision. Okay,
Stephanie Carvin, your quick take on where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I generally support that. I think we still, it's never good to come on TV and be like, but I mean, the fact is there's
I do it all the time.
There's still a lot that we're going to learn, I think. I mean, we're only in week 2 or 3, so I mean, the roller coaster is not even over, so we'll find out.
Yeah, and this week was a bit of a roller coaster. Professor Leah West, Professor Stephanie Carvin, thank you so much for coming in. We always appreciate the insight.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.